Hello and welcome to the History of Ceramics. I'm Paul Greenhouse.
And I'm Stephanie Rosine.
And today we're travelling to 16th century Japan to explore the profound, quiet beauty of the Japanese tea ceremony, the cha-no-yu, and the ceramic bowls that lay right at its heart.
So I think I'm going to ask you to picture in your head, Paul, a tiny, dimly lit hut made of bamboo and thatch. It's hidden at the end of a winding, mossy garden path. The air might smell of unvarnished wood and roasted tea. And inside, the host is quietly whisking bright green matcha tea in the dark in an irregular handmade bowl. This ceremony, this simplicity, it's the ultimate expression, I think, of peace in many ways.
It sounds that way, but we both know that beneath this surface of profound peace, there's a story of incredible political tension. It's a story where the simple act of serving tea was so culturally authoritative by the 16th century, it threatened the most powerful warlords in Japan. Today, we're going to explore the aesthetic of wabi-sabi and how it led to two of the greatest tea masters in history to die by ritual suicide.
So dramatic. So we're going to be landing in the 16th century, but I just want to kind of set up a context here that the custom of tea drinking, as you know, Paul, has come from China to Japan. Tea was introduced into Japan in around about the 9th century, but it wasn't until the 12th century that a Zen Buddhist monk used it in monasteries simply as a way to stay awake during meditation, these long sort of grueling periods. So tea comes on the scene. It grows in its sort of use and consumption. There are tea plantations. And as that sort of popularity of tea rises up, the practice slipped away from its spiritual roots.
Right.
Right?
And we can say the ingredients, caffeine tannin. So a substance that would
sort of wake one up.
Yes, would lift one up, would give one a spiritual thing. It's always important to remember that.
Right. So it comes from this sort of deep place of history, but we're going to fast forward and we're going to drop right into the 16th century in Japan. And we can recall that warlords are fighting across Japan, and it's, there's all these sort of rival factions. And so we're in that similar kind of time period here.
And by the late 1500s, Japan had been unified by the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, he was looking for a way to promote peace at that stage, so he asked a famous tea master named Zen no Rikyū to create a new ritual for him. While the tea ceremony focused on Zen concepts like harmony and tranquility, it was really a political tool for Hideyoshi. He used it to boost his cultural power and cement his dominance. He even famously called the tea the way of politics.
Yeah. And tea was already being used by the wealthy samurai and warrior classes. They would actually hold these lavish sort of tea battles. I think we sort of call them the tocha, where the samurai would drink enormous amounts of tea in formal audience halls, sort of, I guess, in competition with each other. And this was just an extravagant, blatant display of wealth. And it showed off, expensive, perfectly symmetrical, lustrous Chinese tea bowls. So these are porcelain, they're porcelain imports, and they're flawless. Remember, they have that bell-like perfection. The Europeans believe you can see your soul within it. And it's a real display of wealth. But this is not the tea ceremony that I think of when we think about Japanese tea bowls and tea ceremonies.
This is a forerunner of what we're going to get. And probably good to note just at this stage, we're dealing with a very ritualized society pretty early on in terms of like most of the East Asian courts, the Chinese and the Korean as well, are quite ritualized. But Japan very much so, like the samurai, the warrior cult, subject to incredible range of rules and laws and rituals as to how they behaved, and the court as well. So there's nothing weird about Hideyoshi wanting to create a ceremony.
So this is, this is on the backs of a 15th century tea master named Murato Juko, who had decided to completely reject the perfection of these porcelain objects, and I think the wealthy displays that are on through these tochas. He pioneers this frugal tea style called wabi-cha. It's deeply rooted in Zen Buddhism, and it gives birth to the concept of wabi-sabi, which is a word that has made its way into popular culture today.
Absolutely has. It's one of those big terms, and it impacts our world, the ceramic world, enormously. How will we define that?
Well, I always describe it to my students as the perfection of imperfection.
Yeah.
So it's an aesthetic that has profound beauty, and it finds this beauty in impermanence, imperfection, or the perfection of imperfection, to sort of distill it down. Wabi simply refers to austerity or simplicity. It carries kind of a sense of solitude, and sabi has to do with an appreciation of the aged and the imperfect. That as we age, or as an object ages, it gains knowledge and wisdom. And so instead of these flawless porcelain cups, which, by the way, these are not teacups and saucers. These are tea bowls. Yeah. There's no handle on them, right? There's this rejection of this Chinese porcelain cup, and a wabi-sabi tea master would prefer a roughed, sort of unglazed, sort of gritty stoneware. There might be a crack in the lip or a drip of glaze, and it reminds us that everything is temporary. Everything is natural, and so it's much more these wares that rise up are. In comparison to those Chinese tea bowls, we might think about them as less refined, but I think they're incredibly sophisticated, but they really are about reflecting the natural world and the energy, perhaps, of the maker and the material.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. Perfection through imperfection, almost. And that sense, it touches on so many things, doesn't it? But a lot of the major world religions developing, not least Buddhism, but actually early Christianity, Judaism, certainly Islam, in their basic roots, a notion of the simple, the humble. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven, in the Christianic. So there's a notion of poverty being a noble and great thing, which somehow is in there, and nature and natural forms coming through. And this is, I would say, one of the most sophisticated and extraordinary examples of it in a physical object. Yeah, and
so these are the kinds of things that are starting to rise up when Hideyoshi approaches our tea ceremony master, Senyo Rikyu. Yeah. He asks him to really essentially create a ceremony, a practice that really embodies those elements. And Senyo Rikyu takes this almost to a radical extreme in some ways.
Yeah, what we're saying is that it's quite heavily down to him.
It is.
So Hideyoshi is his patron.
Yes.
He's instructing him to develop this relatively new ceremonial approach to the tea service, which is different, which is Japanese.
Which is about peace and harmony, which Hideyoshi is trying to project, I think, culturally across Japan, because he's just unified it.
Absolutely, by murdering his way around.
Excellent.
So, needless to say, now we want love and peace, now that we've won. Right. So Senyo Rikyū was born in 1522 into a wealthy merchant family in the trading city of Sakai. But he rejected commerce early on in order to study the tea ceremony. So it's already, as it were, a ritualistic, religious, philosophical thing. So he doesn't invent that, but he takes control of it almost, I suppose. He believed the ceremony should completely strip away ego and ostentation. So this notion of profound simplicity in all things. And to do this, he rigorously redesigned the entire physical journey of the guest. So we might add also that the developing architectural style of work in Japan is coming into that archetypal period that we recognize, really quite profoundly simple.
Yeah.
And geometric and informal geometry, but stripped out.
And dedicated spaces specifically to perform the tea ceremony. And so we've got a kind of a great little image of his tea ceremony room, his chasitsu. And so let's think through a little bit what it would have been like to attend one of his ceremonies.
We've both done it at one time or another.
We have. I think it's one of the nice things about this topic is it runs all the way through to contemporary practice. I've been a participant in the tea ceremony with tea ceremony masters as well as Japanese exchange students to sort of run the gamut. So
it's a wonderful living tradition.
Yes.
And we would recommend that everyone should go to Kyoto. Everyone should go
including me, because I've not yet been.
Oh, yes. We need to go. We need to go, absolutely. But clearly, it's a really living phenomenon there, which is where I experienced it. So there's I experienced, but I think also a preamble known as the roji. And it's a meandering garden path punctuated quite often by stepping stones. So informal, asymmetric, much in the manner of Japanese gardens many of us are aware of. And you move through that. And the idea is that you're cutting the outside world out. You're getting yourself ready. You're stripping away what was outside. And you're becoming embroiled. You're having to watch where your feet are. And you approach then the actual room itself. Now, we know historically that Rikyū invented a way of making a person even more humble, which he called, in my appalling pronunciation, the Nijryuchi, which was a low crawl-through doorway. In other words, you had to bend up and curl up. Now, we're told that it's partly to do with the fact that if you were a samurai, all kitted up in your gear, you were going to struggle. You were not going to be able to get through with your sword. And you're going to have to curl up and humble yourself
and
to the point...
literally get on your hands and knees and crawl through this door.
You might well have to crawl to get in. So in other words, we strip away ostentation and hierarchy and pride, and we get you down to this very basic thing. We know in terms of the Rikyū's tea room, which is quite different from the one I experienced. It was pretty tiny. It's quite claustrophobic and crowded in. So one would squat cross-legged in a room that might be no more than a couple of meters square. And there the ritual takes place.
And I think this kind of description captures how he was trying to affect and impact the mindset of the participant, right? There's an account that he once asked a young disciple to clean the garden, and the boy spent all day scrubbing the stones until they were completely immaculate. And when Rikyū saw it, he reached up, shook the maple tree, let a few leaves fall naturally across the pristine path. Right. So
there's the philosophy.
There it is. And there's the beauty and imperfection into sort of a sterile environment, perhaps.
I would say, and we'll come back to it towards the end, this idea of celebrating, of creating perfection through imperfection, it's a major, major component in ceramic heritage going forward. And I would argue, even without this sort of conceptual framework, it's an element that every single maker, regardless of culture, regardless of time, has to deal with, because nothing can actually be perfect. We can strive for skill, we can strive for whatever it is you believe that perfection is, but at the end of the day, we have to accept that that doesn't exist. Absolutely. And I can tell you, the very few pots I've made, imperfection, very high on the agenda.
I think wabi-sabi is a great way to describe them, Paul.
Yes, I've got lots of sabi in terms of imperfection, not a lot of wabi at this stage. Yes.
So it's important to note, though, I think that sometimes we can get lost in this, in that to know that Senyu Rikyū was not a potter himself.
Yes, he commissioned artists to make work in this sort of style and aesthetic that he had designed. And so he turns to a Kyoto potter named Chojiro, who is the founder of the Raku family. And our ceramic enthusiasts out there, of course, will recognize the term Raku as a firing process. But it is important to note that we're talking about traditional Japanese Raku here, where the pots are removed from the kiln and allowed to cool naturally in the air or quenched immediately in water. That's very different from the Western tradition, where the pottery is placed into a container with sawdust, paper, leaves, which ignite and then are smothered with a lid to force heavy carbon reduction.
So no two pieces fired in a Raku process are alike, and it really does rely heavily on this understanding that you have to let go of the control. So we've got the Raku family, Chojiro at its head, creating an entirely new sensibility of Japanese tea bowls known as Raku ware, and we're going to take a look at some of those today. What I can tell you is they're incredibly intimate. I think both of us have held these types of tea bowls. They were not thrown on a fast speeding wheel. They were quite slow, and they were carved, and they were shaped entirely by hand. And so when we hand built, and you know, or maybe on a slow hand moving turning wheel. But using tools to carve out and remove the material to sort of excavate this pottery form. They're wiggly, they're thick, they're chunky. They have an undulating line that might look like the horizon of a landscape for the rim. And they're almost always slightly elevated on a really beautiful foot ring, which is also, you can flip that over, hand carve that out. And that foot ring acts as your handle for these objects.
Right. This is a big moment, Stephanie, isn't it? I would say out there in the world not obsessed with ceramic, the term Raku probably known.
Yeah.
And this is the moment.
It is.
It's a family form. Chojiro and his family, that dynasty, create this way of making ceramic, which has persisted for centuries and is still immensely popular. Yeah.
And most of these, the tea bowls from Chojiro are kind of cylindrical, so that we have an example of a red tea bowl and a black tea bowl that we're going to be looking at. Both of them are similar kind of forms, kind of cylindrical. They gently curve inward at the top. They fit really beautifully. I mean, I haven't held a Chojiro, but I do have an interwar period black Raku tea bowl from Japan that I love. And sort of the weight of that sitting in your hand, it fits. It's not like picking up a tumbler, a glass of juice. They're wider. You sort of have to hold them in two hands with the foot ring on one hand, and you're turning the tea bowl with your other. But really, this work it's dark. It's either sort of black and brown tones, or these beautiful kind of rust reds, and I think that they're items of contemplation.
Extraordinarily beautiful things. And as one looks at it and thinks about it, and I've never handled one of these, what one would give to be able to...
Mine's a similar shape. Mine is a very similar shape, but it is 20th century.
Right.
Made in the same aesthetic.
So the idea is that one is transformed by this vessel and by the ritual and so forth, and is pulled into this notion, the wabi-sabi idea of beauty through simplicity, perfection through imperfection.
Exactly. And this Hideyoshi, our general, wanted to use this tea ceremony and these objects to project his political power. It said that he actually commissioned his own portable golden tea room, where all of the walls and the utensils were all made out of gold, and then you had these humble ceramic objects. And so again, it's not really a metaphor. In contrast, it is, right? It's showing power on one hand, and it's showing introspection on the other.
Now, everything you've told us about Rikyū at this stage, how did he feel about working for a warlord? How did that go?
Well, this golden tea room, I think, was a bit of a thing that pushes him over the edge, because the entirely lavish golden tea room is not wabi-sabi.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's political tension that grows between Hideyoshi's increasing lavishness and the tea master's humility, and it rises to this sort of dangerous political standoff.
Mm. I would think a golden tea room wouldn't get the picture. So we're assuming Hideyoshi didn't really understand the thing that
he didn't get it.
That his person had created for him. Yeah. He would be a dangerous man to get on the wrong side of, I would think. So there's a lovely story, which may just be a cultural legend, but perhaps not, that during the tea ceremony, Hideyoshi proudly placed a wild chrysanthemum between a tea bowl and a canister, because he was trying to demonstrate to Rikyū that he understood wabi-sabi. And Rikyū quietly and subtly moved the flower and then continued the ceremony as though nothing had happened. And that really deeply agitated the warlord.
This is the moment which it really tips the argument off. And ultimately, something as small as removing a flower blossom from the middle of a tea ceremony would cost Rikyū his life.
I'm sure occasionally we've all made a bad career move. This was clearly one of the great ones in the history of ceramics. I'm assuming Hideyoshi thought the end was coming in his relationship. What happens from that point onwards?
Well, I mean, whether it's born out of political suspicion, jealousy of Rikyū's, immense cultural authority as sort of the father of contemporary tea ceremony.
Was he becoming a power in himself?
I think he probably was, or at least Hideyoshi perceived that. Whether or not
a cult figure.
Yeah, I think whether or not Rikyū was angling to take over power, that's I'll leave that to the historians. But in 1591, Hideyoshi ordered the 69-year-old tea master to commit ritual suicide.
Right.
That's big. So not only did he
well, it doesn't get bigger than that.
Well, no, and not only did he didn't poison him, he didn't have someone else murder him. He makes this elderly gentleman kill himself, right? So the account is, I think, quite sort of poetic and heartbreaking, that Rikyū holds one last tragic tea ceremony. And after he serves his guests, he actually shattered his tea bowl on the ground, declaring it polluted by misfortune. And he removes his gown to reveal a pristine white death robe, and commits seppuku with his sword. So it was his ultimate acceptance of impermanence.
Yeah. What's interesting is the chrysanthemum story and the bowl smashing is really just that. It's a story or a cultural legend. The actual scholarship provides a detailed account of Rikyū's forced suicide and the alleged crimes that led to his death sentence. Mainly that he erected a disrespectful wooden statue of himself and allegedly profiteered off the sale of tea utensils. That's extremely intense.
It's extremely intense.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to have a falling out with my boss and have him to instruct me to commit ritual suicide.
It wouldn't surprise me. So we've lost the one great figure.
Right. But it's not the end.
No. Hideyoshi, he still wishes to continue with the notion of the tea ceremony. So what happens next?
The tea ceremony has built its own cultural sort of cachet by this point.
Yeah.
So following this tragic death, a new tea ceremony master steps up to serve Hideyoshi.
Yeah. And his name was Furuta Oribe.
And Oribe was actually a general in the army, and he brought a completely different aesthetic, kind of a warrior energy to the tea ceremony.
Right.
And we're going to talk about some of this work that the aesthetic completely changes.
Right, because rather like Raku earlier on, Oribe rings loud ceramic bells, doesn't it?
does.
And I find it fascinating. He was a general in the army?
General in the army. And where Rikyū's tea ceremonies took place in dimly lit, introverted spaces, Oribe designed a completely different tea room. It was multi-windowed, it was expansive, it was connected to the outdoors, and those might be the legacy of tea ceremony rooms today, of sort of indoor, outdoor, wide, bright spaces.
It certainly reflects where I was taken in Kyoto.
Yeah, and the images that I've seen as well.
Yeah.
But as a ceramicist, Raku has a legacy in a ubiquitous name of a type of process.
Yeah.
Oribe is a type of glaze that we refer to now.
Right.
So I have an Oribe glaze in my studio that we use, and it's connected to this person and this legacy.
Do you think about the Japanese army when you're using it?
I do not.
Oh, no,
I think about this beautiful green glaze and where I want to put it. But essentially, he's a radical art director of his day.
Right.
While Riku is loving these individual, monochromatic, symmetrical bowls with slight undulations, Oribe's aesthetic is to encourage chaos and experimentation.
Right. A very different aesthetic.
Yeah. So should we take a minute to sort of talk about a couple of these pieces?
Let's do that.
Yeah. So my experiences with the tea bowl is to be served some sort of small meal, sort of at the outset, maybe a sip of sake, a consumption of these little sweets, which I don't know what they're called, but they're delicious. And so Oribe develops a whole suite of ceramic objects that are kind of accompanying the tea ceremony and sort of an expansion of it. So we're looking at right now one of, I think, a kind of iconic type of piece, which is a basket form, and it's completely asymmetrical.
Yeah.
It's
that's its most powerful feature.
Yeah, asymmetrical in its shape, but sort of repeating elements. There's this basket handle that's almost the same kind of curve as the curve of the back of the piece, and it's not dipped entirely in one glaze. There's flourishes of brushstrokes of maybe of an iron oxide wash, and then dipped in sort of thirds in this beautiful mossy green glaze, which we would refer to as an Oribe glaze today. And these often also have the brushstrokes are reminiscent of different seasons. There's, so we might sort of, this one we're looking at, there's almost sort of flourishes of what look like wheat to me. Maybe this is referencing the harvest. I'm not sure. I don't know.
It's certainly got a sense of extrapolating imagery from nature.
Yeah, in a real kind of painterly way.
Yeah, very painterly.
And so these pieces are really, they're maybe more constructivist, if I want to call them that. They're hand built out of slabs. They have angles and sharp corners as well as curves. And there's sake bottles. So there's a really excellent sake bottle that I have in front of me right now with kind of cylindrical walls, and then it tapers in and it flares. The top third of it is in that beautiful green glaze.
Yeah.
And again, this is a little bit later than actual Oribe. This is sort of, again, in the style. So we see people kind of carrying on these aesthetics.
Returning briefly to the very, very asymmetric basket form, its actual function in the ceremony would be to
have some of those little sweets and
small nibbles
at the beginning, and sort of the presentation of those. We've got this sake bottle, which is actually from the Mino region in the late Momoyama period,
major ceramic region.
Yeah, and it's the area that we associate with the master Oribe. And there's often small kind of cracks within the clay. There's some crazing and cracking within the glaze, where we can look at this and sort of feel almost an agedness. But that's how these objects would have come out of the kiln.
So, Stephanie, looking at the bottle, there's a dribble coming down the side. I think is rather beautiful.
I think it is too.
At the time, they thought so too. Yeah.
And it was intentional.
Yeah.
It was an intentional, again,
You would know that would happen, or something like that.
Yeah, and again, it is still embracing the ideology, I think, of wabi-sabi.
Yeah. So we have a notion of perfection through imperfection.
We do.
And the celebrating of those imperfections. One often hears potters, and I think potters influenced by East Asia, Japan, and so forth, the happy accident.
Yeah.
Of a term. I'm sure there's a more poetic way of saying it, but that's the phrase we've both heard. When it goes into the kiln, you've got a good sense. You've marshaled the material. You know what's likely to happen, but you don't know exactly. Yeah. You don't know where that drip's going to come. Exactly. Yeah. But you know it's going to kind of do that. So the notion of the happy accident is an aesthetic. That's part of wabi-sabi?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and in this bottle we're looking at, you can also, if you look at the neck, you can see a stripe of gold. Yeah. And that's because this piece was broken and mended. So this is we're in a moment contemporarily of wabi-sabi. We are also very much in the moment of kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing a broken piece of pottery with sap and gold leaf. And again, to sort of say that these objects have a life that they lived, and let's honor those pieces. And
when done properly, it actually improves.
It's really beautiful. It's a metaphor for life.
A metaphor for life. I was just going to say that because we all start to get scars and cracks, and I guess we'd all wish to be glued back together using gold, if that were possible. So it reflects experience and growing.
It does.
In tree forms and plant forms and so forth, as well as humans.
Yeah, and so I think if we compare the aesthetic of both Chojiro and of Oribe, there's some common threads for me, at least, of that perfection of imperfection, of wanting to embrace faults, or wanting to embrace the unexpected, wanting to embrace nature, even though the visual aesthetic of these two types of work is drastically different. Yeah. And you know, I think the real big lesson here is don't volunteer to be a master tea ceremony master for a Japanese feudal lord, because ultimately Oribe's life ended just as violently as Rikyū's.
Always wise to not be employed by a war-crazed military maniac.
And so in 1615, amongst shifting power dynamics in Japan, Oribe was suspected of conspiring against the new shogun. So he doesn't even attempt to defend himself, so perhaps he was. And he goes ahead and he commits suicide with his sword alongside his son.
So Oribe comes to the same fate. And who would ever dream that a tea ceremony would be the most dangerous sport in the history of Western ceramics? Something
that's meant to evoke peace and calm and tranquility has met extremely violent ends.
What it flags up from Japanese culture, because it's not going to be much long after that Japan decides to close down for several centuries, and will be coming to in future episodes, as we know, that the West almost loses contact with it, that a highly ritualized culture in which the performance of day-to-day life is subject to formal procedure and becomes part of their politics, really. Yeah. That a tea ceremony could lead to a situation in which a warlord thought it appropriate to order, but then tries to control it to the extent to which he forces two of its key inventors to kill themselves. I mean, that's high politics, isn't it, of a kind. So we've got this extraordinary moment with these incredibly beautiful objects and effectively a new philosophy. It's not Chinese, it's not Korean. The Japanese have been using everything that's around them. This is Japanese. And there's a legacy here, isn't there?
There is, absolutely. I mean, we can look at contemporary makers who are making work today. There are exhibitions that make calls for yunomis, and yunomis are essentially a smaller version of a tea bowl. It's a tea bowl that you can pick up in one hand as opposed to sort of this larger two-handed. But there are makers working within these, the aesthetic of not only the form, the type of glazes that we use, the processes that we use, but also deeply bound up in that is that aesthetic of wabi-sabi, of the perfection of imperfection.
Absolutely.
And how that impacts not only the maker in their intentions, but the user and their relationship with that object.
And we'll be coming to it in other episodes. Massively important for the rise of studio ceramics in the modern period, especially from the early 20th century onwards. Enormously important, the entire package.
It helps drive, I think, Western cultures move away from industrial ceramics into something that a drive to have it feel handmade, as opposed to industrially produced. So I think what these objects remind us is that whether or not we're having sort of a quiet embrace of the black Raku tea bowl in its simplicity, or the wild asymmetrical energetic lines and asymmetry of an Oribe vessel, it's teaching us to stop striving for whatever that perfection is, and embracing nature and embracing the impact of our hand as makers.
Yeah, I actually, even as you say that, because the two types very different. Oribe clearly very different from the earlier tea bowls, but taken as a whole package, as a philosophy, as well as an approach to ceramic. Is that the single most important influence on the rise? I would say, let's look at Britain specifically, because it's everywhere, but I would say arguably the single most important influence on early 20th century studio ceramics. And what they're looking at, because there's a wide range there, but what they're looking at is as much the philosophy, the approach to life, the approach to nature, the approach to the idea of there's an underlying morality there, isn't there? The two great originators were forced to commit suicide. There's clearly a morality at work, which their boss didn't like. So we're dealing with something that's going to impact the modern period really very dramatically.
Well, and I think they ask us to hold two things at once, right? They ask us to hold imperfection and the temporary in the palm of our hands.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to end it there today, and we'll continue.
That was hugely interesting, Stephanie.
And we'll bring it back and connect it to studio movements in the 20th century in future episodes.
I can't think of a better preparation than to move into the modern period proper, where this material, the modern period couldn't have happened without it.
And to remind maybe our younger users that wabi-sabi did not originate on TikTok. So
it's not TikTok. Wabi-sabi is not TikTok.
That's going to be it from us today. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard on this episode, please make sure to follow The History of Ceramics wherever you get your podcast, and go ahead and leave us a comment. Or go to henny.com/The History of Ceramics.
Goodbye.